There are things a man knows without being able to explain them. Not logic, not evidence. Just something that sits in your chest and won't leave, no matter how many times you tell yourself you're overreacting. I've lived long enough to know the difference between anxiety and warning. And what I felt that Tuesday morning in October was not anxiety. It was a warning. I was 63 years old, retired, living alone in the same house I'd raised my son in. My wife passed 8 years before that, and some days the quiet in those rooms still surprises me. I'd learned to fill the silence with routine. Coffee at 6. The news I barely watched anymore. A walk around the block if my knee allowed it. And every other weekend, my grandchildren. That was the one thing that made everything else matter less. My son had gone through the divorce 2 years earlier. It was ugly in the way divorces with children always are. Not loud, not dramatic in the beginning. Just slow and grinding, like something being worn down by water. His ex-wife got primary custody. The judge cited stability, proximity to the children's school, the fact that my son traveled for work, all reasonable things on paper. All things that ignored what my son had been telling his attorney for months, that something in that house wasn't right. But you can't walk into a family court and say, "I feel it." You need documents, witnesses. You need proof. My son had none, so he got every other weekend and one dinner a week, supervised during a 6-month probationary period because his ex-wife's attorney had made him sound like someone he wasn't. He swallowed it. He kept showing up. He never missed a visit. His ex-wife had remarried by then. A man I'd met exactly twice, once at a school event where he barely acknowledged me, and once in the driveway when I dropped the children off, where he watched me from the front porch with his arms crossed and never came down to say a word. My grandchildren called him by his first name, Derek. They never called him anything warmer than that, and whenever I noticed it, I told myself it meant nothing. Children adjust at different speeds. My granddaughter was 9. My grandson was 6. I'm going to call them by their names here because they deserve that. Lily and Owen. Lily had her mother's eyes and my son's stubbornness, which I always thought was a gift even when it wasn't convenient. She was the kind of child who noticed everything, remembered everything, and said less than she knew. Owen was the opposite, all noise and motion and questions without end, the kind of boy who would ask you why the sky was blue and then follow it with 4 more questions before you finished answering the first one. That October, my son was away for 10 days. A work trip he couldn't get out of. He'd arranged for me to pick the children up that coming Saturday for our regular weekend visit. His ex-wife had agreed. It was on the calendar. Everything was in order. But Tuesday morning I woke up and the feeling was there before I was fully awake, sitting on my chest, heavy and specific. I called my son. He didn't answer time zone difference, probably still asleep or already in a meeting. I left a message that I'm sure sounded strange. I just wanted to check in. Call me when you get this. Then I sat with my coffee and tried to reason with myself. It had been 11 days since I'd seen Lily and Owen. That was normal for the off weeks. I wasn't supposed to contact them except through their mother, which she'd made clear was a boundary she expected respected. My son's attorney had advised we comply while things were still fragile, so I complied. But 11 days felt long in a way it hadn't before. I picked up the phone and called her number. It went to voicemail. I left a polite message, just checking in, looking forward to Saturday, wanted to confirm the pickup time. She didn't call back. I told myself it meant nothing. People miss calls. People get busy. I made lunch, watched half of something on television, went for my walk, and the whole time, that thing in my chest didn't move. By Thursday, she still hadn't returned my call. I tried once more, voicemail again. This time, I didn't leave a message. Friday morning, I got in my car and drove to the house. I know what you're thinking. I know how it looks, a grandfather showing up unannounced to his ex-daughter-in-law's home the day before a scheduled visit. I thought about that. I almost turned around twice on the drive over. But I kept going, and I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't. The house was a 2-story colonial on a quiet street about 20 minutes from my place. I'd been there enough times to know the layout from the outside, where the garage was, which windows faced the backyard, where you could see into the kitchen if the blinds were up. It was a Friday morning. The children should have been at school. I parked one house down. I don't know why. Some instinct that I didn't want to announce myself yet. Her car was in the driveway. Derek's truck was not. The house looked ordinary. Curtains closed on the second floor. The front porch light was still on even though it was nearly 10 in the morning. I sat there for a while. Then I got out. I told myself I was just going to knock on the front door, a normal visit. An unexpected one maybe, but nothing alarming. I'd ask about pickup time for tomorrow. I'd smile. I'd leave. I walked up the driveway instead of the front path. I don't know why I did that either. I just did. The garage was detached, set back from the house toward the left side of the property. There was a narrow side yard between the house and the fence, mostly dead grass and an old garden hose that looked like it hadn't been moved in months. I walked past it without meaning to stop, and then I heard it. It was so quiet, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A sound like something between a word and a breath, coming from the direction of the garage. I stopped walking. I heard it again. It was my grandson's voice. I would know it anywhere. 6 years old, and it still had that particular pitch, that particular uncertainty at the end of each sound, like everything he said was also a question. He was saying something I couldn't make out, saying it softly, saying it to someone or to no one. I moved to the garage's side door, the small one, not the rolling door, and tried the handle. It opened. The interior was dim. One small window on the far wall, filmed with dust, letting in just enough gray light to see by. Garden equipment along one wall, old boxes stacked in the corner, a folding table pushed against the back. Owen was on the floor beside the folding table, sitting with his knees pulled to his chest. His wrists were zip-tied together. Not handcuffed, zip-tied, with a thin cord running from the zip tie to a metal ring that had been screwed into the base of the table. He was still in his pajamas, the kind with little rocket ships on them that I'd given him for his birthday. He looked up when I came in, and his face did something I don't have the right words for. It collapsed and opened at the same time, like relief and terror arriving together. "Grandpa," he whispered. I was across the room before I was aware of moving. I got down on the floor beside him, my knees screaming, and I put my hands on his face first, just to look at him. He was pale. His lips were cracked. There was a red mark on his left cheek that hadn't come from anything accidental. "Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere else?" I kept my voice low and even because I was terrified of what was still outside that door. He shook his head, then nodded, then shook his head again. He didn't know how to answer that. I looked at the cord, looked at the zip tie. I didn't have anything to cut it with. I found a rusted pair of garden shears on the shelf behind me and I used them, working carefully. It took longer than it should have. My hands were not steady. When his wrists were free, he grabbed onto my arm with both hands and held on. He didn't cry. He just held on. "Where is your sister?" I asked. "Where is Lily?" His face changed. He looked at the door that led from the garage into the house. Just looked at it. "Is she inside?" He nodded, very slowly. In the way children nod when they're afraid the answer will make things worse. I took my phone from my pocket and I called 911 right there in that garage. I know some of you watching this might wonder why I didn't call the moment I heard him, or the moment I saw him, or before I even went to the garage. I've asked myself the same thing. The honest answer is that my brain was not working in order. I was a 63-year-old man on his knees on a concrete floor with his grandson's hands wrapped around his arm, and the part of me that knew how to act rationally was somewhere behind the part of me that was trying not to come apart. I told the dispatcher what I'd found. I gave the address. I was told to stay on the line and stay where I was. I did not stay where I was. I kept Owen behind me, and I opened the door into the house. The kitchen was directly ahead. It looked normal. Dishes in the drying rack, a coffee cup on the counter, a child's drawing held to the refrigerator with a magnet, a house, a sun, 2 stick figures, no faces on either one. I noticed that detail without understanding why it bothered me. I called my granddaughter's name, once, then louder. A sound from above. Footsteps, quick and light, the footsteps of a child. And then her voice from the top of the stairs. She appeared at the landing like something from a dream I hadn't known I was having. 9 years old, and she looked younger than that, or maybe older, I couldn't decide. Her hair was uncombed. She was wearing clothes that didn't match, things grabbed quickly or worn for more than a day. She came down the stairs, and when she reached the bottom, she stopped about 2 feet away from me. She didn't run to me. She looked at Owen first, checking him the way an older sibling does, scanning, assessing. Then she looked at me. "How did you know?" she said. I didn't have an answer for that. Not one I could explain. "Where is your mother?" I asked. "She went to the store." Lily said it the way children say things they've been told to say. Flat. Rehearsed. She looked at the front door instead of at me. "And Derek?" Her face went still. Not blank still. The way a child's face goes when a name means something they don't want to say. "He left yesterday," she said. "They had a fight. The police arrived 7 minutes later. I know because I watched the time on my phone, standing in that kitchen with both grandchildren close to me, the three of us quiet in a way that felt like we were all waiting for something I couldn't name. When the officers came through the front door, my ex-daughter-in-law was pulling into the driveway behind them. I watched through the window. She got out of the car holding a paper grocery bag, and she stood very still when she saw the police cruiser. She didn't drop the bag. She didn't run. She just stood there, and I saw her face work through several things very quickly, and then settle into something that I can only describe as the expression of someone calculating. She had an answer for everything. Owen had gotten into the garage himself. She told them he'd been playing, and the door latched behind him. The zip tie was from a craft project she couldn't fully explain. The cord attached to the table was for, and here she paused, for his safety, because he had been acting out and she was worried he'd hurt himself. She said all of it calmly. She referenced her rights as his mother. She mentioned my son by name in a way that implied instability. She suggested, without quite saying it, that I was an unreliable presence who had shown up unannounced to cause trouble. I have to give her credit, in a horrible way, for how well she'd practiced. But there were 2 officers in that kitchen, and one of them was a woman who had been kneeling beside Owen for the last 4 minutes, talking to him quietly. And Owen, 6 years old, with his cracked lips and the mark on his cheek and the red lines on his wrists, Owen answered her questions. Children tell the truth when they feel safe. That's something I've learned and relearned across 63 years. You don't have to ask them the right question. You just have to make them feel like the truth won't cost them anything. He told her his mother put him in the garage when he was bad. He told her it had happened before, different numbers of times that he tried to count on his fingers. He told her Derek was the one who decided how long he had to stay. Then he looked at his sister, and Lily, who had said almost nothing since I arrived, who had been standing slightly apart from all of us with her arms crossed over her chest in that particular way. She had Lily sat down on the kitchen floor, right there between the table and the refrigerator with its faceless stick figures, and she started to talk. She talked for a long time. I won't put all of it here. Some of it isn't mine to share, and some of it I still can't think about without having to set whatever I'm doing aside and just sit with it for a while. But I'll tell you the parts that matter. Derek had been the one who started the garage. He'd framed it as discipline, a consequence for behavior that he and their mother had decided was unacceptable. Lily was old enough to know it was wrong, but young enough to not know what to do with that knowledge. She'd written a letter once and given it to her teacher at school, and for 2 weeks she waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. She didn't know if the letter had ever been delivered or read, or if it had simply disappeared into some drawer where letters from children go to be forgotten. She'd stopped fighting it. She'd started protecting Owen instead, telling him which behaviors to avoid, which days were safer, what to do if the garage door closed. 9 years old, and she had built a system. I had to stand with my back to the room for a minute after she said that. I was looking at the window above the sink, at the neighbor's fence, and the gray October sky, and I was doing the thing where you breathe carefully and count and remind yourself that losing it right now won't help anyone. The children were taken by CPS that afternoon. My son landed back in the country 3 days later. I picked him up at the airport and I drove him directly to the CPS office, and I sat in the parking lot while he went inside because he needed to do that part without me watching his face. My ex-daughter-in-law was arrested within 48 hours. Derek was picked up 2 days after that, at a motel in the next county he'd been there since the fight she'd mentioned, apparently under the impression that distance would separate him from whatever was coming. It did not. The legal process took 14 months. I'm not going to pretend it was clean or fast or satisfying in the way people imagine justice is. There were hearings and continuances and motions that I didn't understand and phone calls from my son's attorney explaining things I had to have repeated twice before they made sense. There were days when the whole thing felt like it was balanced on something very thin, like any small wind could tip it the wrong way. But my son had something now that he hadn't had before. He had Owen's words, recorded carefully by a woman who knew how to listen. He had Lily's account, consistent and detailed and given to 3 separate investigators who each noted the same things. He had the marks on Owen's wrists, documented by a physician within 2 hours of my finding him. He had the metal ring screwed into the base of that table, which had been there long enough to leave a rust circle on the concrete floor beneath it. And he had the letter. Lily's letter to her teacher, the one she'd given up on, turned out not to have disappeared after all. It had been passed to a school counselor who had added it to a file and then, in the way of overwhelmed systems, had done nothing further with it. That file surfaced during the investigation. The letter was handwritten in purple marker, misspelled in several places, and detailed enough that the prosecutor described it in emotion as among the most compelling pieces of evidence she had encountered in 14 years of this work. Lily had written it on a Tuesday. She dated it in the upper right corner, the way they teach children to do. My ex-daughter-in-law received a sentence of 22 years. Derek received 17. His attorney had argued diminished responsibility, that he'd deferred to the children's mother on matters of discipline. The jury took less than 4 hours. I think about the people they are now in a facility, serving that time. I know enough about how those places work. From years of watching and reading and talking to people who've been close to the system, to know that the particular nature of their crimes is not unknown to the other people they share space with. There is a code inside those walls that exists apart from any law, and I've heard enough accounts over the years to know that it tends to find expression in ways that the guards don't always rush to interrupt. I'm not a man who takes comfort in that easily, but I won't pretend I take no comfort in it at all. My son has full custody now. Lily and Owen live with him in a house about 40 minutes from mine, close enough that I see them most weekends. Owen still asks approximately 400 questions per visit, which I find exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Lily started soccer this fall, and she is relentlessly competitive in a way that made both me and my son look at each other over her head during her first game and say nothing because some things don't need to be said. She still has that letter. A copy of it, anyway, the original is in evidence. I asked her once if she was glad she'd written it, even though it seemed for so long like nothing would come of it. She thought about it the way she thinks about everything, which is to say she took it seriously and didn't rush to answer. I wrote it because I needed someone to know, she said finally. Even if nothing happened. I needed someone to know. I go over that Tuesday morning sometimes, the way you go over things you know you'll never fully understand. The coffee I didn't finish. The news I wasn't watching. The specific quality of the feeling that came before I was fully awake. I've tried to name it, to explain where it came from, and the best I can do is this. I am a grandfather. I have been one for 9 years. Whatever it is that happens between people who love each other across the distance of years and miles and circumstances they can't control, I believe it is real. I believe it moves like something between radio signals, something you receive before you know you're listening. I drove to that house because I couldn't not drive there. That is the most accurate thing I can say about it. Owen asked me once, several months after everything had settled, why I came on a Friday instead of Saturday. He asked it the way children ask things they've been carrying quietly, not casual, not accidental. He'd been thinking about it. I told him I just had a feeling. He accepted that completely, the way 6-year-olds accept things they've already understood in some wordless part of themselves. Then he asked me what we were having for lunch, because that was equally important. But Lily heard it from across the room. She was reading something, or pretending to. She had a habit of listening while appearing not to. And she looked up at me over the top of her book, and something passed between us that I don't have a word for. An acknowledgement. A recognition. She gave me the smallest nod, the kind that means I know, and then she went back to her book. There are people who will tell you that instinct is just anxiety with a story attached to it. That the times we listen to a feeling and it's right, we remember, and the times it's wrong, we forget. And that's all intuition ever really is, selective memory. I spent a lot of years half believing that. I'm a practical man. I like things I can verify. But I've been 63 years old and I've watched enough of this life to know that some things operate below the level of what can be verified. The love between a grandfather and his grandchildren is one of those things. It doesn't follow rules. It doesn't clock in and clock out with the visitation schedule. It doesn't wait for the right day of the week. It drives to the house on a Tuesday when nobody asked it to. I've talked to my son about the things he missed, the signs he didn't see, or saw and didn't know how to interpret. He carries that weight. I've watched him carry it, and I've told him what I believe, that he was a good father fighting inside a system that didn't believe him, and that what happened to his children is not a verdict on his love. He hears me. On some days he believes me. On other days he is quieter, and I let him be quiet, because there are some things a person has to carry even when they're unjust. That is the other thing I'd say to anyone watching this who has felt the way my son felt, who has sat across a courtroom and been told that their fear was unfounded, their concern was overstated, that everything was fine in a house where everything was not fine. The system is not always right. The paperwork is not always the truth. The calm of someone who has learned to appear calm is not the same as safety. Trust what you know. Do it carefully, do it legally, do it with documentation if you can get it. But trust it. I did not walk into that garage with a plan. I walked in because something that had lived in my chest since Tuesday morning would not let me do anything else. And my grandson was sitting on that concrete floor in his rocket ship pajamas, and my granddaughter was upstairs alone, and the letter was in a folder in a counselor's office waiting to be found. I just had to be there to set things in motion. That's all any of us can do most of the time. Show up. Pay attention. Be willing to look like a fool for the people we love. The coffee I didn't finish that morning is still the best decision I've made in a long time.